Hey, good morning. This is Carl Blackstone with the Columbia Chamber. We're thrilled that y'all are joining us. I tell you what, I'm gonna give it 2 seconds and we're populating everything with folks that have been waiting in the waiting room. So we'll just give a couple more people, we've got a couple more seconds and we'll begin. Good morning, Suzanne. All right, so we're thrilled that you are here with us today. Thanks for joining us at the Columbia Chamber. Again, I'm Carl Blackstone. A couple of housekeeping things. We've got everybody on mute. If there is a chat box, and feel free to put in a comment if you have one. If you'd like to if you're not on camera and you want to send us an email, info@columbiachamber.com, and we'll get your question to Congressman Clyburn. But it's my real honor to have Jim Clyburn with us today. For many of y'all know, Congressman Clyburn has been serving our state for a long, long time. One I greatly respect. So thank you for taking the time to be with us today. For those that don't know, he's actually sitting right upstairs from me. We moved in the same building. So I'm thrilled that he has graciously given us some time today and to talk a little about what's going on. So first of all, let me just say hello. I hope you're doing well and the family's doing well during these times.
I think as far as I can tell, everything is going very, very well. Thank you so much for having me here. I don't know how you want to move with this, but I want to just begin my comments and I'll try to respond to any questions you may have. I might answer one or two. I'll respond to all of them. Just to thank you all for what you do and to say how much I appreciate your constituents, the small businesses throughout our state, not just here in Columbia, and what they mean to the local economies. I've looked at all the studies done, and it's the small businesses that you represent that make up so much. In fact, one study says as much as 50% of what takes place in the business world. So thank you all so much for that.
Well, listen, these are extraordinary times, and no one, I think, in our lifetime has seen anything like it. But we were chatting, there's plenty of history to teach us on these things. How about give us your viewpoint of, from your vantage point in Washington as your role as the whip, how you think the government's done on the response, your thoughts on the CARES Act and the PPP, and let's start there.
Well, let me start a little bit before that.
Okay.
If you recall, when all of this first came to pass, if I might call upon my background growing up in the parsonage, we got what I consider to be a very, very understated response. The White House asked us for $1.9 billion to respond to what was on the horizon. We knew when it got to the Congress right away that we needed more than that. And we agreed to around $9.8 billion, thinking that would allow for testing to take place on the scale that we thought it needed to be. Lo and behold, within days, we knew that was not adequate. And so Congress passed another bill. This time, focusing on the family. If my memory serves, it's somewhere around $400 billion to focus on families, keeping families stable. We just really didn't see what was coming even at that point. And Congress then went back and came with the CARES Act, $2.2 trillion to respond to what we saw. This time, we were moving to try to not just do what needed to be done with state and local governments, what needed to be done out in the communities to really expand this whole notion of testing to try to begin dealing with what we call tracing, and then isolation, and then treatment. And even that, we knew within days, because around 390 billion of that was going to businesses. Now the problem was small businesses were defined as under 500 employees. And then, of course, when we did that, almost immediately, the banks were ready to do what they could do, but being bankers, following what the law and backgrounds and experiences required, they dealt with their customers first. And then they dealt with the ability to pay back the loan first. Then this Fed then stepped in and said, wait a minute, we're taking this stuff off the books. We can't afford for you to limit your involvement just to people you had experiences with and with people that you feel got the ability to pay back. So then we passed a fourth piece of legislation. This time we called it emergency, $480 billion. This time we targeted some of those resources to smaller businesses, the barbershops, the restaurants, just small businesses that did not get approved the first time out. And I'm going to thank the banks and the lending institutions, because we also brought in credit unions. We brought in community development, what we call financial institutions, CDFIs, not necessarily the big banks, but people who work with restaurants and barbershops and beauty shops and flower shops and Main Street stores, clothing stores. These people had relationships, and it's now working famously. In fact, I met with a banker on the day before yesterday at one of my favorite meeting places, a golf course. And we talked about the successes that were being experienced, and the fact we're now told a window was opened up, as you know, for these small businesses to come in and get the assistance they needed, and it's now working. I hope that we are seeing the kind of effort that will be successful for smaller business to really, really participate. So let me just say that we're not there yet. If we are really going to get this pandemic under control, we are going to have to take some significant steps beyond that which we have already done. Now, in this last piece of legislation, we did put in about $60 billion, I'm sorry, about $25 billion for testing. 11 billion of that to go out in the communities. When we were debating that, I got in touch with Governor McMaster, with the president of the Medical University of South Carolina, and the immediate past chair of the board of the Medical University of South Carolina. And I said to them, we've got to look at this money that we're going to make available. I knew we were going to pass it. And I said, we got to employ mobile testing. We got to get these mobile units out here to start testing people. Now, no one has to tell me whether or not that can be successful. When Fritz Hollins was a United States Senator, the late Fritz Hollins, he worked the Senate, I worked the House. When we saw that South Carolina was leading the nation in amputations because of the late detection of diabetes, we decided to earmark monies from the federal budget to stand up mobile testing units to take out into the rural parts of South Carolina, on the Sea Islands of South Carolina, to test for diabetes, because we saw it as wreaking havoc, not just on people's personal lives, but it was having a tremendous impact on our voluntary armed forces, because people were showing up, getting tested, sick, and having to be denied. It worked famously. we were able to drive down. That was the #1 ranking that we were pleased to get rid of. And we drove down dramatically the amputations taking place in South Carolina. I had a personal relationship with that. As many of you know, my wife passed last September after almost a 30-year battle with diabetes. But she died at the age of 80, and she still had all of her limbs. When her father passed away, he was a double amputee because of the late detection of diabetes. So it works. So what we've got to do now is get mobile units out into these areas, out into rural areas, not just rural areas. Medical University of South Carolina has started mobile testing. They're now in Columbia. My zip code, 29203, most prevalent presence of COVID-19 seem to be in that zip code here in Columbia. And so what we're doing now is got mobile units out at Eau Claire High School, operating from there, getting this testing done. We got to do that all over South Carolina. And the studies indicate that we need about 30 tracers. We got to test, and then we got to trace. You need about 30 per 100,000. Now, you know, I'm a history guy. I don't know much about math, but 30 times 100,000, we got what, 4.68 million people in South Carolina. So you do the math. Just in the top of my head, we need about 1,400 testers, trackers, what we call them tracers out here. So that's what we've got to do now. We are getting ready to do a 5th piece of legislation. It's being marked up now. It's going to be called CARES 2. I am going to be working hard to do 2 things in that legislation. Number 1, expand community health centers so that we can get people within commuting distance of a community health center throughout this country. Number 2, we've got to expand broadband deployment. We are not going to be able to do the kind of tracing that we need to do without broadband. And we're not going to be able to get our schools back open and functioning properly without broadband. Let me finally say this and I answer the questions. It bothers me tremendously. And I've been using this as an example, not to be embarrassing to anybody, but the fact of the matter is all of us know that over 60 years ago, Brown versus Board of Education started in Clarendon County, South Carolina. The very first case, Briggs v. Elliott, was in Clarendon County, South Carolina, then School District 23. Today, that school district's number is 1 in Summerton. That school district has only 34% broadband adoption in the households. That means over 60% of the students in that school are not going to be able to have online education, which is going to be required if we have a second round of this pandemic come the fall. That means that kids will lose a second year of school. So we gotta have broadband. And I think that we can make the case. And I hope that South Carolina will step up and show the nation how it can be done. We did it with diabetes. We can do it with COVID-19.
Congressman, I think you're 100% right on the rural broadband, man. With we significantly, it diminishes our ability to teach kids, but also the telehealth piece of it, and which is going to play a pivotal role going forward, I believe. Thank you for those comments. Let me just real quickly for those on the call, if you have a question for Congressman Clyburn, feel free to type it in the chat, or again, info@columbiachamber.com, and we will get it to you. There's one comment. Let me throw one in for Robert. Robert, I think he addressed PPP, but the, he wants to talk about your book. He goes, he read your first book, and have you gotten any time to during the pandemic to think about a second book?
Well, it'll be a third book.
Third book.
Yeah, my first book would happen to have been about the Clarendon County Briggs v. Elliott, the families that started Briggs v. Elliott. I call it Uncommon Courage. My second book was my memoirs, Blessed Experiences. Now, the reason I call the book that is because as one that I see on here today, you may call her Henry, I call her Henri Baskins. She was a student of mine down in Charleston back when I was a public school teacher. And I often said throughout my life, started when I was a student at South Carolina State, that we can be no more, nor can we be any less than what our experiences allow us to be. And I always say that all my experiences have not been pleasant, but I've considered all of them to be blessings. And therefore, that's why I call that book Blessed Experiences. And I am looking at a third book. I don't know. I thought I was going to have time to work on it, but as you know, I just got appointed to chair the select committee on COVID-19, which means that I will be pretty busy. So I don't know if I'm gonna do much on this book, but I'll tell you a little bit about it. The book has to do, and here's the title: Before I Was First, There Were Eight. That's my working title. I have no idea whether or not the experts would keep it. Now, the reason I called it that is because people often call me the first Black since post-Reconstruction, and I say it that way because, as you know, Reconstruction only last 12 years and was over in the 1870s. And when people say I was the first Black in the Congress from South Carolina since Reconstruction, I said, no, all the Black people who served in Congress from South Carolina were were after Reconstruction. So I'm the ninth. There were eight before me. So I'm calling the book Before I Was First, There Were Eight. And it's going to be about those eight, that time, all men who served in Congress from South Carolina, what their interests were and what contributions they made. And just to give you one, Robert Smalls, for instance. Robert Smalls was from Beaufort. I now represent many of the counties that Robert Smalls represented when he was in the United States Congress. He spent 10 years in the state legislature and then 10 years in the United States Congress, born a slave in Beaufort. Well, Robert Smalls was the one that introduced the resolution in the first Constitutional Convention after Reconstruction that gave South Carolina another good number one. We in South Carolina was the first state. We were the first state that put in place free public education for everyone. That resolution was introduced to that Constitutional Convention by Robert Smalls. So these are the kind of things I'm looking at, all of these men and trying to see what might highlight their careers in the United States Congress and as well as in the state legislature.
Well, I'd encourage everybody to go to DC and visit your office where you can see a picture of all eight in your boardroom. It's a great representation of South Carolina. So let me throw in, one quick comment. I want to come back to the COVID, the select committee, subcommittee on COVID-19. Well, while we're there, let's go ahead. What do you see your role in that? Obviously you're chairing it, but y'all are going to look at a couple things, oversight of funds and ensuring equity in the distribution of allocation of those funds. Anything that you're really looking at in that committee? Absolutely. And let me give you a little bit of history of that as well. This committee is being patterned after what's called the Truman Committee. Harry Truman, when he was a junior senator from Missouri, look back at what went on
during World War I. All of the price gouging, the profiteering, the fraud and abuse that took place during that period. Now we got to also remember 1917, World War I, but 1918 was the Spanish flu. So there's two big catastrophic events taking place in the country. 116 committees were created in order to take a look at what went wrong. Harry Truman looked at that. This little guy comes in from Missouri, never had gone to college or anything, just a guy that understood human nature. And he went around at all the bases, Department of Defense installations throughout the country. And he came back and said to the Senate, look, let's put together a committee, put it in place to review what's going on, what goes on during this war. It would be much better for us to have one committee being proactive than to have 116 committees being reactive. Congress agreed, put the committee together, or the Senate did, put the committee together and named him to chair it. According to all of the studies, it cost the country $1 million. The committee saved the country over $15 billion and scores of lives, especially according to the study, the lives of children. That's what we're patterning this committee after. We want to make sure that when we put money out there, that three things take place. Number one, it is done efficiently. Number two, effectively. And number three, equitably. Making sure that the people who need to be tested get tested. That's one of the reasons the House didn't go back into session. When Nancy Pelosi called me to talk about the 1,000 kits that was being made available by the White House for us to be tested and come back to work, I said to her, never should we go back in front of the people who were sweeping the floors, taking out the trash, polishing the furniture. These people are essential to our being effective Congress people. We should not jump the line in front of them. And so when we get to the point where we can test everybody that's essential, I think that we have not done our jobs. And so I, for one, voted against going back until such time we can have testing for all the support staff. I understand it takes 20,000 people to run the Capitol. So give us 20,000 tests. And then when that's done, we'll take our rightful place. Congress people should be third in line. Number one ought to be the support staff there on the Hill taking care of the building. Then should be our staffs, and then us.
Good point. Let's jump into a couple questions. Ron Harvey says, thanks for the insight and all that you do. Mary Louise Resch with Habitat has a couple questions. Well, one, obviously during these times, nonprofits have taken just a hit across the board, especially in South Carolina with the number of recovery pieces that we've got tornadoes and COVID at the same time. What support or what do you see coming down the pike at CARES 2.0 or long-term federal assistance in place? How do you see the CARES Act looking after the next round of changes?
Well, you know, in the so-called emergency funding for CARES, the first CARES package, we insisted upon, and even in CARES, we took place. We decided that churches and charities had to be a part of it. Mm-hmm. And we believe very strongly that we cannot have effective recovery, an effective program, if churches and charities are not treated equitably. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about equity. We say that, you know, the government can't do this. We have to depend upon the charitable organizations, either mercenary organizations, to do this, that, and the other. If that's true, then let's treat them that way. And so the staffs, private nonprofits, the staffs of churches, even the pastors, when churches can make the case that they're losing revenue, and they are, then we, with the CARES package, can help pay the salaries of the pastor. They can help pay the organists and the people, we call them sextons in the church, but the people who cleaning up the church. And the same thing for either mercenary organizations as well. And to the extent that people are having experiences with that, which may not be good, please let us know how you think we can do, what would you think we can do to improve our relationship or the support for charities and other philanthropic organizations.
Great. Yeah, that's a big piece. I know you and I have talked, and I know others have hit you as well, that John Durst is on with the Restaurant Association. All C6s have taken a hit. And I know that's part of the conversation coming up in CARES. And so I hope C6s are included in there as well. Any other?
Absolutely. John, thank you so much. In fact, I think I'm having a similar session like this with them next week with the Restaurant Association. And I hope by that time we'll be far enough along on this legislation so I can be a little more definitive about what we are doing. But John, don't wait. Let me know as soon as you can about what's not being done that you think should be done, because that's important to me. Restaurants is another business. I talk about experiences. We had one of those when I was a kid, and my family decided that we could go broke faster doing something else.
That's fine. For those that we got a few more joining, but feel free if you have questions to shoot them in the chat box or info@columbiachamber.com. Take your questions. I've heard over the several senators across the country question. Just would love to get your opinion on the CARES Act as it goes forward. There's a $600 federal check side for those that are qualified for unemployment.
Sure.
What's your take on, would that continue past July? Do you think it may step down a little bit? What do you think?
Well, I think that there's a more efficient way for us to do that. I think that we'd be able to get people back to work, and we ought to be subsidizing the employers in order for them to keep their employees on staff, and rather than laying them off, going to unemployment compensation, keep them, and then send the bill for keeping them to the United States so that you be reimbursed for keeping them on the staff to the, commensurate with how much business you're losing. I think that would have been a much more efficient way of doing it. I've been looking at what's been going in a few European countries, and they've done it sort of that way because you've got a real problem when you are supplementing the unemployment insurance state by state, because what you've got here in South Carolina, I think it's somewhere around $240 or $50, I'm told, that the average UI check is. Then we put $600 on top of that. Some people have said, well, that means this person will end up being paid more just on unemployment than staying at work. Well, you wouldn't have that problem if we said to, or that issue, I don't know that it's a problem, maybe you aren't paying them enough. You wouldn't have that issue if people stayed on the jobs and go to work every day, and then we reimburse the employer for keeping that person on the job rather than them going out filing for unemployment compensation. I forgot, 30,000 people? I forgot how many in South Carolina, but I think it was something like that.
It was like 1 week we had 83,000 new folks. It was a lot of people.
83,000 new?
New claim, what was 2 weeks ago? It was significant.
Yes. Well, see, to me, a much more efficient way of doing that is to stay on the job, And then we'll work with the federal government. I mean, the federal government would then work with the employer to see what the cost is to keeping that person on the job.
Yeah, makes sense. Two quick, I know you got to get back to work, but a couple more quick questions.
Sure.
In the next phase two, I know we touched on rural broadband, but there was also conversation around infrastructure. And I would argue rural broadband is part of infrastructure.
Yep.
What else do you see what's the conversation around other infrastructure packages?
Well, I know that when we start talking about infrastructure, people think most immediately about roads and bridges, and some go to water and sewage and rail and ports. And here in South Carolina, ports are very important. That is the Charleston port, and I always put the Georgetown port in that discussion as well. I remind people that there's an S on port when it comes to South Carolina. So that's Charleston and Georgetown. So that's very important. But at the same token, we've got to look at broadband as being, in my opinion, should be at the front of that line because it is what supports education. It is what supports healthcare delivery. It is what supports community development. So we're going to have broadband as a part of any infrastructure package going forward. Now, how much more is added to that will depend upon cooperation with the White House and the Senate. Because the problem we've got is that when you're doing emergency funding, and this is what COVID-19 is, you don't have the big problem of finding pay-fors. If you put together a regular infrastructure package, you got to find a way to pay for it. And then that means that the House, the Senate, and the White House would have to join hands and jump off that bridge together. No one person is going to go out and put together a big pay-for an infrastructure package, and no one entity without the other. So that's the problem with an infrastructure package, agreeing on how to pay for it. And I have some very strong feelings about that because, just for an example, if you're going to have infrastructure, a big part of that's going to be transit. And people look at, well, you know, we don't have any subways out here on Johns Island. Well, you do have rural transportation programs. So we got to look at what's going to be impacted by infrastructure, look at the roads and the bridges, look at the water and the sewage, because that's a big healthcare issue as well. Look at the ports and the rail, and then let's jump off the ledge together in trying to pay for it. Yes. So until we come forward with some big pay-fors, we aren't going to get an infrastructure, a broadly based infrastructure bill.
Okay. Got another question, a couple, if you don't mind, to see.
Well, I don't mind.
Okay.
It's up to you guys.
To expand on Mary, this is a question from Nancy. To expand on Mary Louise's question, for every 2 days, all restores across South Carolina have been closed. The gross revenue loss was equivalent to the average hard cost to build one home. Habitat is committed to ensuring South Carolinians have a safe and affordable place to live, but lost revenue due to safety concerns is a true concern for our affiliates and why we try to build and respond to disasters. How about, let's see, sorry. Are we seeing a critical need for flexible federal support for the state level to ensure that South Carolina homeowners who own their homes don't lose them to COVID-19 related delinquency? Is a homeowner assistance fund similar to the previous SC Help a consideration?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think some of that's already in place. I have to give her credit. And she is on this select committee. Maxine Waters, who chairs the Financial Service Committee, has been jumping up and down about this program as it relates to home ownership. Look, I think that what we've got to do is really define affordable housing beyond rental units. To me, we've got to make home ownership affordable. And that is something we've been arguing for in all of these meetings. I can assure you that that is a very critical part of this. In fact, I think we're making headway, making housing itself an infrastructure issue. When you start talking about stabilizing families, securing communities, and really standing up what I like to say, individual dignity. Home ownership is a part of that. And we all know that during the Great Recession back in 2008, going into 2009, it was the biggest wealth eliminator in minority families, because the unusual number of minority families, what wealth they had developed was in home ownership. And they lost home ownership, they lost significant portion of their wealth. So the home ownership and wealth development will be big in all of this. And I assure you, yours truly will be at the front of that line arguing very strongly. You know, affordable housing to me is far beyond rental units.
I agree with you. Chuck Whipple, what type of manufacturing companies will look to manufacture in the U.S. as a result of this? What do you think? How's the landscape change now, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's going to change it significantly. I think that we're going to see people looking inward for so much of energy sources, for instance. I think that in South Carolina has done well. I know that there's some hiccups this past year over what to do about solar energy and how, what legislation needed to be done. But I think that solar and wind, renewable energy is going to be a really, really big thing going forward. I really believe that when we start thinking about home ownership, I think we're going to have to get beyond our traditional notions about how homes ought to be built. I think from the very beginning, they ought to have solar, alternative sources of energy as being a part of it. A few people may not know this, but we've got one of the biggest wind turbine facilities down in the Low Country. Clemson University is running it. Back when you did the 2009 so-called recovery package, there was a little item put in there to experiment developing a biggest in the world, we think, wind turbine facility. It's Clemson University that won that. And it's now being done down in the old naval shipyard at the site of the old naval base down in Charleston. So that kind of stuff, I think, is going to come to South Carolina, or could come to South Carolina, or to this country. And so we're going to have to really, that's the kind of stuff that I think we should do inwardly, rather than worry about who may or may not be coming to our shows. Let's do what is necessary to develop livelihoods here and restore dignity in people's lives.
Well, I tell you, I've been working, and I know Jeremy Cato is on here with Midland Tech, and we've done, we're just FYI, we're putting together a grant that was sent up last week to help retrain 16 to 24-year-olds who maybe got caught up in this COVID stuff. And really, we've got to educate a workforce. We've got to redesign what South Carolina looks like after this. And I'm excited about it. I think there will be a lot of changes. Speaking of changes, I want to wrap up on this one. Ron Harvey says, Congressman Clyburn, you've been through some very tough times and made it. What has helped you the most to be so resilient that you can help small business owners during this pandemic? Well,
this may shock you a little bit, but I think that one of the first things one must do, there are two big things that drive me. Number one is one should never give up. I remember when, when I first ran for office back in 1970, I ran to represent Charleston in the state legislature, was declared the winner at 10 o'clock in the evening. In the morning, rang and the TV reporter was at my door and he said to me, "You better get down to the courthouse, something is going wrong." When I got down to the courthouse, they told me that rather than being the 500 vote winner, I was a 500 vote loser, because when they were adding up the votes, somebody forgot to carry a 1. That was a tough way to lose an election. So when I got to my office the next morning, a reporter called and asked me, some of you remember her, Barbara Williams, who became the editor of the Post and Courier, News and Courier at that time, called me and she asked me, what happened? I said, looked like I didn't get enough votes. And she says, "Oh, Clyburn, you know what everybody's saying. What do you think happened?" I said, "Well, I just never got enough votes." And that's not what I was feeling. But I learned growing up not to always express my feelings. Well, because I expressed something other than what I was really feeling, John West saw the headline the next day. I didn't get enough votes. He invited me to his staff, and I have not looked back since. And I say to young people all the time, look, you're told from childhood, if at first you don't succeed, you try and try again. I ran 2 times after that and lost 2 times. And after I lost the 3rd time, a friend of mine said to me, "What are you going to do now? You know what they say, 3 strikes and you're out." I said to my friend, that's a baseball rule. Nobody should live their lives by baseball rules. And so that's the second thing I want to say. But finally, I would say this. If you're going to really be successful, you shouldn't be hesitant about going out beyond your comfort zone. I was on one of these calls several weeks ago, and Frank Pallone from New Jersey was talking about energy and what we needed to do. And he brought up Thomas Edison, who did his research there in New Jersey. And so when Frank finished talking, it happened to be at one of my whip meetings. I said to Frank, Frank, Thomas Edison did some great work. I said, but you know, that light bulb that he kept trying to get to burn would never stay on. And he never got it perfected until he went up there to Boston and found a guy named Louis Latimer, who had discovered a thing called a filament. Louis Latimer, who happened to have been a black guy, the son of former slaves. I said, when Thomas Edison, the white guy, got beyond his comfort zone and sat down with Louis Latimer, the black guy, together, they lit the world. Sometimes, in fact, oftentimes, in order to really be successful, we have to get beyond our comfort zones. And I suspect that I've never had any problem doing that. I've never had any problem not giving up. And I've never had any problem holding my peace when I think it's better to say what's on my mind.
Well said. And I tell you what, best way to close. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your leadership and for your support of the business community here throughout South Carolina, especially here in Columbia. We really appreciate you, and very, very grateful for you this morning for giving us all this time. Thank you very much. By the way, for all those on the call, we're going to have this recording up on our website later on. So if you missed something, or if you know somebody that needs to listen, we'll have the chat recorded and posted on the website. Thank you much.
Thank you very much. Tell Mitchell Willoughby, I see him on there, that I thought I would hear from him today. He didn't ask me, but thank him so much for being kind.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Good seeing you, Ms. Baskins.
Leadership.
See you later.
Thank you.